Welcome to another episode of the South Asia Democratic Forum podcast. Today, we are delighted to host Dr. Nilanthi Samaranayake, a leading expert on South Asian security, maritime strategy, and Indo Pacific geopolitics. Dr. Samaranayake's work spans government, academia, and think tanks, with a particular focus on the Indian Ocean region and Sri Lanka's strategic role within it. As geopolitical competition intensifies across the Indian Ocean, long held assumptions about maritime neutrality, regional equilibrium, and rules based order are increasingly under strain. Sri Lanka finds itself navigating complex pressures from great power rivalry and regional security agreements to maritime governance debates under international law. In this episode, we explore whether concepts such as the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace remain viable today, how Sri Lanka's defense and naval strategies are evolving, and what opportunities and risks lie ahead as Sri Lanka seeks to assert its maritime rights under UNICLOS. I am joined today by my colleague and co host, Natasha Fernando. Dr. Samaranayake, welcome to the SADF podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Tapas. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So, Dr. Samaranayake, to begin at a broad level, if we look at the Indian Ocean region today, with rising militarization, extra regional naval presence, and escalating geopolitical tensions, how should we understand Sri Lanka's strategic location and agency? And the second part of the question is Sri Lanka primarily a small state adapting to external pressures, or does it still have room to shape regional norms and outcomes in meaningful ways?
Sure. Those are two really important questions. I would say for the first question, you mentioned Sri Lanka's strategic location. Certainly, Sri Lanka, as a smaller state, it has certain attributes or notable characteristics. Its strategic location is certainly an important factor for the country and for maintaining its sovereignty. The fact that it has been successful in leveraging its location along the main east-west shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean and really developing a thriving, robust port sector is really quite notable for Sri Lanka. So, and you mentioned the concept of agency. The fact that Sri Lanka has been able to develop this successful port sector, certainly in the South Asian region, that has helped to build its agency. But at the same time, getting to your second question about Sri Lanka being a smaller state, it does face a lot of pressures. You mentioned external pressures. There's certainly, we saw the obstacles it faced most recently with the debt default in 2022. So and certainly in the years preceding that, this was sort of a slow moving disaster, an economic and a social disaster and a political disaster for the country. So certainly that was a combination at a national level of really having a significant challenge for Sri Lanka and in holding back its development and its advancement. So that would tend to impede its agency and its ability to stand on its own. Of course, as a result of the economic crisis, it had to depend on some of its partners for basic goods, for imports. So certainly it faces obstacles which limit its agency. And I understand we'll talk about the Iran conflict and how that has also posed additional challenges coming externally facing the country. So it really, to some extent, really reflects the dilemma of a smaller state where there are certain strengths and attributes, such as Sri Lanka's location, and it's able to capitalize on those attributes. But at the same time, it is a smaller state and it is facing significant obstacles both at the national level and externally.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samaranayake.
Natasha, if you kindly allow me to add just this recent cyber attack
Sure.
in Sri Lanka, and resulting into the theft of 2.5 million US dollar. That will add to the challenges of Sri Lanka's current woes, right? So over to you, Natasha, please, as the co-host.
My question is that you mentioned that Sri Lanka had undergone a lot of like adversity economically, politically, and socially as well, because it was just after the Easter, after COVID, and then you had the Easter attacks, and or maybe I messed up the timeline: Easter attacks, COVID, economic crisis, political crisis, and then right after the government changed, that was a big natural disaster.
Yes.
And we saw during the cyclone Ditwa, all these countries from different parts of the, particularly India, which is the closest neighbor, and then the US. I was so surprised that even after having a very frustrating situation between the US and Sri Lanka concerning the defense agreements and the MCC, which the US lobbied for very, very forwardly and very, very hardly with a lot of effort with the Sri Lankan government and Sri Lankan think tanks, and that didn't work out for the US. The government scrapped those proposals, particularly the MCC. But US kept on aiding Sri Lanka in times of need, such as the latest humanitarian disaster we had with the cyclone Ditwa, which is also kind of surprising given that US internationally they were cutting off aid through closing down US aid. And when you look at all this, the enduring relationship they've had with Sri Lanka is something amazing. So do you have any reflections going forward about whether the Sri Lankan government should reconsider and restart this debate about US defense agreements in Sri Lanka, or whether it will eventually surface given the Iris Dina incident?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It's a long timeline that you've mentioned. I would add, though, that really we should only think within this current Trump administration, so only for the last year. But yes, I think some of the points you mentioned go back to, I would say, really since 2015, and that's when the Good Governance Coalition defeated Mahinda Rajapaksa. And so from the US government's perspective, they saw an opening to advance defense and security relations. And so that, to my understanding, is the context in which that window was perceived as the US wanting to advance relations with the US, including on any kind of defense agreements. And from my perspective, that also followed a couple years earlier, where the US was also trying to advance its defense agreements with Maldives too. So looking at Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean, Maldives, both in the central Indian Ocean, my view is that the US was looking a bit broader and wanting to advance regional partnerships. So when the Good Governance Coalition, when they defeated Mahinda Rajapaksa, because relations with that government were so difficult and so fraught because of the war, I think the US government saw an opening there with that leadership. But now fast forward more than 10 years to the current Trump administration, and it's adopted a very different approach to US foreign assistance. It's basically much more judicious now in allocating assistance to foreign partners. So, but it is interesting though, because the US government has still, in their statements, that there still are partners and areas where the US does want to cooperate. And Sri Lanka has been listed as an important maritime security partner. And so there do seem to be efforts or initiatives to help advance cooperation on the issue of maritime security, and including right now a recently transferred retired US Coast Guard cutter is sailing by the Sri Lanka Navy back, to Sri Lanka now. It left the United States shores. So, that's kind of the most tangible example of the U.S. giving its assistance to Sri Lanka, and hopefully this will be a ship that will be in the Sri Lanka Navy for many years. So I think it's important to think about the timeline of the particular U.S. initiatives, whether it's the defense agreement that you mentioned, or like transferred retired Coast Guard cutters and maritime security cooperation. I think that is important, especially now, because there has been such a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy within the past year.
Absolutely. I have that part of the question that I wanted to see if you'd have some views on it, whether this government, would it be in their best interests to accede to the SOFA or the AXA agreements, which is, well, AXA is less contentious than the SOFA agreement, because SOFA is to give the US rights to construct a base in Sri Lanka, whereas the AXA is more for logistical purposes. It's a peacetime agreement, but now it's not exactly peacetime when the US has declared a war in Iran. Do you think the government would consider these proposals, or would they just outright reject?
Well, I am not aware of a status of forces agreement or a SOFA being under consideration right now between the US and Sri Lanka. I know it was several years ago, but I'm not sure if it is under consideration now between the Trump administration, the US under the Trump administration, and Sri Lanka under the Dissanayake administration. So that would be interesting to know. I'm not aware of that discussion. But the two agreements you mentioned are a bit different. The AXA is really a logistics agreement that was last renewed. It goes in 10-year cycles or increments. So it was last renewed in 2017. Right. Theoretically, it should be up for renewal next year in 2027. And it was also signed in 2007 as well. The status of forces agreement, excuse me, that is a bit more advanced agreement. The AXA is really about logistics and enabling logistics cooperation and the exchange of payment for certain services like fuel replenishment. That's a kind of a mild agreement. India, for its part, it signed its own version of that, a logistics agreement in 2016. It has a different title, but the status of forces agreement is a more advanced defense agreement. I wouldn't say it's for a US base, though. It's really about enabling a more seamless, a more efficient transfer and exchange of US forces when they visit foreign countries. So I'm not aware of basing discussions about, the US wanting to set up a base in Sri Lanka. I'm not aware of that. But the status of forces agreement, I'm not aware of that being a subject up for, discussion right now. So that would be interesting if that were a development between US Sri Lanka relations. But yes, it was certainly in the news several years ago. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Samaranayake, because it was it's interesting for us as Sri Lankans know that there is a distinction between like having a base and then having like just exchange of personnel and jurisdiction concerning their criminal activities, because base is something very serious. And that would, of course, trigger a lot of anxiety in Colombo. So my next question is, I think I'd like to have a bit more a discussion around the Iris Dina, the sinking of the Iris Dina off the coasts of Sri Lanka, and how the Sri Lankan government responded to that disaster which happened. Do you have any thoughts of how that attack puts probably a little bit of strain on the US relationship? But you could explain it a bit more about the consequences that it could have in the Indian Ocean region.
Sure. I think it was quite a shocking development when a US submarine sank a warship. So that was very, I think, to any observer of the Indian Ocean, it was quite shocking to see that take place. And then, of course, for Sri Lanka, it's gone through a lot of struggles, as we've discussed, especially in recent years with its debt default and also with its political turmoil. And, I see Sri Lanka as really just trying to get its footing, or really just really trying to establish a firmer footing in a very difficult environment. And then the sinking of the ship took place. And so that requires additional resources for Sri Lanka. From my observation, it seems that the Sri Lankan military responded to the sinking when it was notified. The reports are that the Indo-Pacific Command notified Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lanka Navy conducted a search and rescue operation, also assisted by other services like the Air Force. And so the from a military operational perspective, Sri Lanka, I think, performed a professional operation and helped clean up really the aftermath of the sinking of this Iranian ship. And it has required additional resources by Sri Lanka, military resources, diplomatic resources, at a time when Sri Lanka is already very overburdened already.
Thank you so much. So, I was also wondering about the kind of responsibility that Sri Lanka has towards humanitarian disaster relief operations, given its limited resources, especially now that there is some talk about extending the jurisdiction of Sri Lanka's territorial waters, because we already know that the territorial waters is 27 times that of Sri Lanka's land mass. So it's a um, large area to cover with maritime reconnaissance and, well, to see if Sri Lanka has the capability to surveil that area and to send rescue to ships in distress or personnel in distress is something that is being discussed, I think, currently, especially with that proposal that has been submitted to increase the territorial waters. Do you have any reflections on that? Is it a good idea? Could it have like some consequences with Sri Lanka's bilateral relations with other nations, particularly India, where we'll see kind of like a I'm not sure what word I can use to describe, like there'll be like a problem between India and Sri Lanka on the sharing of these territorial waters and the rights that are within it. I haven't studied this in detail, but I'd just like to know your reflections on this.
Sure. My understanding is that Sri Lanka, many years ago, and I think it was 2009, have they made a claim for the continental shelf, and it's under consideration at the UN. I don't think there has been movement on it. I haven't seen any news of that, but it is still a claim that Sri Lanka makes for essentially a larger share of the continental shelf. And yes, that would certainly affect claims by the neighboring countries like India, Maldives, I think even Bangladesh in the Bay of Bengal. So that, yeah, I mean, it's been, what is it? It's more than 15 years. So I haven't seen any movement on it, but it would be interesting if there is some development, perhaps in the UN system, that actually we see some forward movement on the issue, because yes, there would be implications and consequences for Sri Lanka's bilateral relationships with its neighbors.
So the Sri Lankan Navy also came up with the 2030 Naval Strategy, a document that was published by the Ministry of Defense, which I very recently came across. Had some ambitious plans for naval modernization, but given the fact that our economy is not doing very well since the economic crisis, and we are still picking up the bits, moving forward, I think that with the incidents that recently happened, naval modernization is definitely, it should be in the tables for discussion. But we also have lack of resources. So, what do you think about this document, the Naval Strategy 2030, that was put forward by the Ministry of Defense?
I think it's good to see Sri Lanka putting out its strategy, because it's really, I think it just reflects that continued advancement and growth of not only the Sri Lanka Navy, but the Sri Lanka Sea Services. But when we think about its larger equities, the Air Force certainly has an equity as it patrols the maritime domain in Sri Lanka. There's also the Sri Lanka Coast Guard. So reading the document, it reads to me as if the Sri Lankan military has really reflected on what its role is in advancing the wider national goals of Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka as a country, it really prioritizes its maritime domain. I don't think that was necessarily always the case, but I think there has been in recent years a recognition of just how important the maritime domain is for Sri Lanka as an island country. And given its location along the main east-west sea lanes in the Indian Ocean. And so, given the importance of the port sector to the country, Sri Lanka needs a military and sea services that can really provide security for the country and for the port sector, and that contributes to security in the wider Indian Ocean region. So the strategy, it looks like the Sri Lankan military is really reflected on what its role is in advancing the country's goals when it comes to its economic goals, when it thinks about how the port sector can bring in income to the country. So that also helps to address some of the economic challenges that Sri Lanka is facing. And to your question about the size of the military, I think you were talking about just given the economic issues that Sri Lanka is facing. I think at the same time, it's also important for it to have a military that can also defend its maritime interests, because the military and the economic goals are interconnected in that sense, because the maritime domain is so critical to Sri Lanka's economy that there needs to be a defense of Sri Lanka's interests in the maritime domain. So I think in that sense, those are interconnected goals. But the question specifically on the military is for Sri Lanka really to find the right balance of what are the overall national economic resources that should be devoted to the military and the sea services.
Thank you so much. I think that was a very interesting discussion that I had, and was very insightful as well. I appreciate very much your comments about what Sri Lanka can realistically do. It's definitely up to the government, but I mean we can have discussions on it. So I do have a few, maybe just one or two more questions, but they would just largely be on the peace and stability of the Indian Ocean region, particularly given the Iran versus US war, because it definitely has spillover effects in the Indian Ocean region. So I believe that it could escalate in the future, but it largely depends. It's a very unpredictable crisis. We never know what could happen in the future that could escalate or de-escalate. So in that sense, if we look into a possible escalation, what would you think would be is a good strategy for Indian Ocean littoral states, or even like middle powers that have interests in the Indian Ocean? Do you have some thoughts about it? I'd like to hear some.
When as I have been observing the developments in the Indian Ocean since the conflict started, I've been thinking about the Indian Ocean countries and how they've been viewing the events between the U.S. and Iran. And I think, right, you mentioned the Iranian ship sinking, and I think that this really calls to mind Sri Lanka's initiative from the 1960s and 70s, the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace. Sri Lanka was talking about the importance of maintaining a peaceful, stable Indian Ocean region back then due to the Cold War superpower competition between the US and the Soviet Union. And so when I saw those events of the sinking and also just some of the fallout in the Western Indian Ocean over the war, I started to think about that Indian Ocean Zone of Peace concept. Eventually, India lost or India dropped its support of Sri Lanka for that when you think about the timing of its nuclear test, and some of the priorities were different between Sri Lanka and India at the time, because India was growing and expanding its national power and defense capabilities. And I think at a certain point, that Indian Ocean Zone of Peace concept, as Sri Lanka was conceiving of it in the 70s and 60s, it had become a bit outdated for a rising Indian Ocean power like India. But I do think there is some relevance to the broader concept of trying to seek a stable Indian Ocean region, because that is largely what the Indian Ocean has been, at least when you contrast it to the Pacific theater, where we've seen more flare-ups, like in the South China Sea between the claimant states, or the East China Sea, whereas the Indian Ocean, by contrast, has been more peaceful, more stable, relying on international legal venues. Certainly, there are some disputes between claimants in the Indian Ocean region, but by and large, it is a more stable, it has been a more peaceful theater compared to the Pacific. But what's interesting is this conflict with Iran. This is actually making the Indian Ocean theater, this is a bit of an aberration for the Indian Ocean theater. It's heated up really since the conflict started. So we'll see. The conflict is still very much, well, there's still very much a dispute between the US and Iran. And so there are many military implications, including for the Indian Ocean region. So it's really still an open question. But in my view, it has been an aberration compared to what we've seen with relatively greater stability in the Indian Ocean theater.
I'm not sure if you were aware of this, Dr. Samaranayake, but this is actually something very interesting that I came across in 2017, 2018, 2019. It was a proposal by the Russian, the Atomic Energy Agency, to build a nuclear power plant in Sri Lanka. That is for benign purposes, because sometimes they share nuclear technology for the purpose of generating energy. So this has not received a lot of coverage in Sri Lanka, but very recently I had a friend from the University of Laval who looked into news sources in the Russian language, and she came across articles on the Russian side that they were discussing building a nuclear power plant by the Russian Atomic Energy in Sri Lanka, but I think Sri Lanka didn't go ahead with it. There were initial discussions with line ministries, I believe, and some inputs were sought out from the Defense Ministry think tank, but thankfully we didn't agree to allow the Russians to build a nuclear power plant in Sri Lanka. I've even asked some of my friends who are engineers who would have like some knowledge about this, and they said, oh, Sri Lanka is actually one of the best places to build a nuclear power plant, specifically in an island off the coast of Sri Lanka, where it can have where the plant can itself be built, but the problem would be with nuclear waste management, etc., etc. I don't have a lot of knowledge on this, but thinking about it geopolitically now, especially when Russia invaded Ukraine, and if they did build a power plant in Sri Lanka, that would have been like a target. I mean, you never know, right?
That's very
Yeah.
interesting.
So, do you have any thoughts about it? Maybe not. Maybe it's something that I just told you, but would you have any thoughts?
Well, it's very interesting to hear. I wasn't aware of that proposal. So that's very interesting to hear that Russia and Sri Lanka were talking about that. In my mind, it made me think about Bangladesh and the Russian nuclear power plant in Rupur in Bangladesh. So just thinking about parallels about what the timeline was of that project, and then when the timeline was of Sri Lanka and Russia discussing that. But the energy crisis now really shows the appeal of diversifying sources of energy. So I think that this issue, it's certainly not, I don't think it's resolved yet.
Yes, exactly. And that would have had like some serious consequences in the Indian Ocean region. But if Bangladesh had done it, Sri Lanka, well, probably might consider it in the future, unless there is like a strong lobby that opposes this idea. But I don't think the government ever really seriously pursued it. Anyways, Tapas, do you
This
have any last questions?
I am not going to ask any questions, but I just want to share that what Bangladesh has gone through about this Rupur nuclear power plant, because everybody wants to be in control of their energy production. So that was the main reason behind Bangladesh going ahead with this nuclear power plant. And without any doubt, the Russian technology regarding this power plant is quite sound. But the only problem is generally Russia doesn't want to take any burden of clearing that nuclear dust or the wastage. So they don't generally want to take care of that. Given the position of Sri Lanka in an ocean, definitely Sri Lanka is in a better position, because the cooling of power plant, especially the core of nuclear energy making core, I think cooling it down through river water or sea water is very, very important. So that's why uh, in Bangladesh it was built near a river, and they actually, what happened in Bangladesh's case, I will just say very briefly. There was allegations of corruption within the internal officials, Bangladeshi officials. But apart from that, what happened is that when I visited the vicinity of the power plant, the locality has improved a lot. It was a very small village, but now it's a city. People are speaking Russian. Even the shops have put up Russian names, and it is a amazing change in that area. So the economy has boomed, centering the Russian technicians, because a lot of Russians are there to run the whole plant. So whether it is a successful investment in Bangladesh or not, in coming days we will discuss about it more, or whether it is a environmental disaster, that we don't know yet. Given the present power shortage in Bangladesh, I can say that the Rupur power plant isn't providing that much energy in our power backbone yet. And that's why that there is so much power shortage in Bangladesh right now. And we are still depending on Indian power supply. So let's see what happens in the coming days. Nilanthi, we can invite you for another podcast on this South Asian nuclear power plant dream, that how most of the countries can become dependent or earn their sovereignty on their power production. So with that, as I said, like, thank you very much, Nilanthi, for agreeing to talk with us on this important topic, because Sri Lanka is definitely a crucial player in the Indian Ocean politics. And not only politics, the economical situation in Indian Ocean. So it's important for Sri Lanka. So thank you, Natasha, for asking the questions, and Nilanthi for giving us the time. Hopefully, we will meet up again in another podcast on another important topic. And with that, I thank you.
And thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.